this. What is a diverse-oriented church?
A diverse-oriented church, let me define it sociologically first because of the groundbreaking work of Dr. Michael Emerson, Corey Edwards, and George Yancey, and others. We have defined in the 20-plus years that I've been in multi-ethnic ministry as a congregation that consists of at least 20% of another ethnic group. Or, to say it another way, a church that is no more than 80% of one ethnic group. Now, it's important to distinguish, as they do as sociologists, that we're not talking about 20% of several ethnicities, but generally 20% of one ethnicity. That would be the sociological definition, whether people accept that or not. We found it to be true in our own ministry because when you get to the 20% tipping point, then it influences staff, style, and symbols, singing, and so forth. For example, if you had a 200-member African-American church and say you had 10% of Caucasians who attended that church, then that church is really not going to integrate. The 10% in the minority will simply acculturate to black worship. Nothing wrong with that, but that would not really be considered under this definition a multi-ethnic congregation. But when you get to 20% and you all of a sudden have like 80 people, then it begins to change staffing, symbols, style, so forth and so on. And so that's the sociological definition of a multi-ethnic church that we have used across the years.
Nice. And you would be the guy to actually give us the perfect definition of that. So,
well, we've had some experience.
Well, yeah, you're right. And I would say as a denomination, we're looking to better that, if that makes sense to the listeners.
Sure.
Okay. So how narrowly or widely should we dare to define diversity?
Well, that is a great question. That's why I said and qualified a sociological definition. Our experience certainly is not the panacea or the be-all to end-all. I would not ever attempt to so narrowly define the multi-ethnic church that it discounts churches that are diverse ethnicity and age-wise at less, say, than 20%. I think the important aspect is that there is enough of a critical mass that actually triggers people to fellowship with others in the true biblical sense of fellowship who may not look like me, think like me, or vote like me, so that we can have authentic relationships cross-culturally. And then in addition, we have found in our years of ministry, Brandon, that being intergenerational as well as mosaic or multi-ethnic is almost equally as difficult because, again, with a younger generation and a older generation within the same worship context and service context, you still have many of the challenges that are necessary or that are evident in terms of really truly integrating a congregation as far as intergeneration is concerned. So I would not attempt to so narrowly define it such that people who don't meet that numerical standard are not being multi-ethnic. At the same time, I don't think that it's authentic to say that we have age and ethnic or economic diversity in a given context, and you don't have a critical mass that's actually triggering change in the way you operate.
That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. So what do you think it means to be colorblind, and should we be colorblind?
I think, humanly speaking, it's impossible not to be colorblind. As someone said in a movie once, if you don't see my color, you don't see me. So humanly speaking, it's impossible for us not to be colorblind. Spiritually speaking, I think to say that a person is colorblind is as, what is the word I would use, short-sighted as saying that the earth is colorblind. I mean, God created a beautiful earth, and it's a spectrum of color, from flowers to water to you name it. And so I think to say I'm colorblind is to miss much of the sovereign and intentional beauty that God has built into the universe. And it's the same with people. So spiritually speaking, however, as Paul says in Acts, in his ministry to Athens, we all come from one blood, and we know that in theory. But with our sinful, fallen nature, we let things like geography, color, culture divide us.
Yeah, and that's unfortunate. You know, when I look at diversity, I like the fact that there's differences. You know, I should be able to walk into a room and look at people and they not all look like me. I mean, sure. I take pride in that. I don't know if most people do, but I take pride in that I can walk into a room and not everybody there looks like me. You know,
right.
And I have this saying that I'm not colorblind and I don't see color. And I use that lightly to basically explain, yeah, I see color, but it's not supposed to make or break who we are.
Right,
you know?
Right. And at the same time, because I know you and I know that many in the audience this way as well, I can walk into a building of Jesus followers, and they may all be different than I am, as I've done in Singapore, Indonesia, and yet experience a oneness that only can come from the glorious gospel of Jesus Christ. And so I may be a minority in that context, but I am just as much a part of the body, and I have to be comfortable enough to walk in both worlds when it's necessary.
Yep, I agree. And that is very true. And as Christians, we have to think like that. We have to have that mindset of being able to walk in different worlds despite of how we look. Okay. Amen. So, Rufus, how does a person's upbringing affect their acceptance of people who are different from themselves?
Well, I think that's where it starts, and that's huge. All of us bring our past, good and bad, into any context or relationship. All of us bring our old Adamic nature, which is good and bad, into any context as well. So the earlier we can train children in the ways and admonition of the Lord, the better the next generation will be, which is why the Israelites were told never to let your children forget that you were slaves in Egypt and how God freed you, and you are now to worship him and him only. When the next generation understands that and it's downloaded into them, then that experience becomes less and less of an issue. But particularly here in America, I'm not saying anything you don't know, and many of our audience don't know, the experience between African American and European or Caucasian America has been vastly different. And that, of course, has impacted generations. And so I have to be aware of that on both sides if I'm going to authentically deal with some of the tensions that we live in. One of the things I love about the New Testament model, and that's what we have in the New Testament as a model, is that the Jews and the Gentiles, on the first day of the church, birthday of the church, they leaned into the tension of what it meant to be a Jewish and Gentile group of Jesus followers, they knew they couldn't just adopt Judaism, and they knew they could not adopt the Gentile polytheism. They had to create another way, a third way. So bringing all their baggage, their sinful nature, their experiences, their culture, all of that had to be laid at the foot of the cross without them losing their identity or distinctions. And nothing can do that or enable that or empower that but God the Holy Spirit. It's a miracle, which is what attracts the outside world.
Yeah, I would agree with that one. Now, you familiar with James chapter 2, verses 1 to 13, right?
Indeed.
Okay, I'm very proud of myself. I don't want to sound boastful, but I got a chance to preach on this passage at a school, and
yes,
I'm sitting there and I'm like, what am I going to preach on? And obviously, I went straight to Revelation 7:9 because it shows the whole picture of how heaven will look despite of what the world looks like. And I started reading and trying to, properly exegete Revelation 7:9. I'm like, I can't preach this to these students. So I kind of started looking more, and I came across James. Now, James is probably one of my most favorite books in the Bible. I said it about the whole Bible, disclaimer. But when I was doing my study in James, he talked a lot about favoritism, okay, and how favoritism could affect the assembly, and then how the assembly could be affected, and how how the whole thing could play out if that type of behavior continued. So my question is, does the acceptance or non-acceptance of others carry into the church?
Yeah, and I think that is exactly what Jesus in his life on earth and distilling this through his apostles as well came to do. And that is to get outside of the Jewish ethnic or the Israel ethnic and to be a custodian of the word of God to other nations. So when he talked about, for example, parables where he made a Samaritan the hero of a story, it shocked his audience because those Samaritans were marginalized, demonized, vilified, and so forth. And yet Jesus came to mingle with them, seeing and teaching his disciples that they are as much children of God as possible. So James picks up that same thing about favoritism when he talks in James 2 about someone rich or well-to-do walking into a building, and the people of the church are so seduced by their status that they immediately bring them to the front. But then if someone of a different economic status walk in, you tell them to stay at the back. And so he was saying to his audience, taking a page from Jesus himself, who taught him that God is no respecter of persons in terms of your economic status. When we come in this building, or we assemble together wherever we are, then we are all under him, and we're all equal in that, as far as that's concerned. So, yes, I think that the church, taking a page from Jesus, his parables, the way he mingled among those who were diseased and afflicted, as well as the apostles who learned that lesson, albeit it took them a while. They did learn the lesson, and I think James 2 sort of capsulizes the thinking and teaching of the apostles of that day.
Right, and when I was doing my study in it, I think the Greek word for respect of persons is I can't even say it. I had it when I was studying it, but
sure,
Greek is pretty hard. But one of the things that I will say is, during this study, it's like, okay, if we as humans can look at James and look at the lesson he taught, and then go back and tie it into Matthew 28, the Great Commission, and study that one, and then look at Acts 1:8 and how the church should look, and how the church looked during the times of Acts, and then jump forward to